Welcome back to the Mike Oldfield Discography podcast. And this is the third episode. We're talking about HERGEST RIDGE today. For me, it's probably the greatest of all time. So I don't really know if I should be saying much. Also, I left my notes at home. So
words can't do justice to this anyway.
Yeah, Tobias will have to give the background info and analysis and everything.
Everything. So after the success of Tubular Bells, it's not yet reached its peak yet, but it's allowed Mike to live an independent life as a musician without any financial need to be recording projects he isn't fully invested in. He finds a place to move to in the countryside. He moves away from the city and starts working on his second solo album. I think it's difficult to talk about HERGEST RIDGE in many respects precisely because it is so minimal in many ways. It allows for such a deep discussion, and it opens up so many different spaces. And the other one is, and this has always surprised me from a historical perspective, is that there is not a lot to be found on it in terms of background information. I find this absolutely stunning as a journalist. Maybe it's a sign that the music scene, that the business was really different back then. It's certainly a sign that Mike Oldfield as a career artist it was different from anyone else. I mean, Tubular Bells, at the point when he's moving away to start working on HERGEST RIDGE, was number one in the UK. It had already sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It wasn't the big international success yet. That came later that year, 1974, when it was used for The Exorcist. And then basically crossed the pond and became a huge success in the States as well. But still in the UK, he was basically a superstar at this moment. So I would have expected that the media would have been all over this. It's the sophomore album after the big, incredible success of an album which was no one believed in originally. So you'd expect there to be a huge interest in this, and still we have virtually nothing. So maybe the great thing, maybe it doesn't matter whether
you mean in terms of writing, or
in terms of writing, I think
because it was an instant number one. Right?
Yes, so. It was an instant number one. Undeniably, it was also a fall off from Tubular Bells. If the numbers are correct, then Tubular Bells sold 5.5 million in the UK and 18 million worldwide. HERGEST RIDGE sold apparently around 100,000 in the UK and 2 million worldwide. I mean, these are incredible numbers by any means, but it's still, in terms of a fall off from the first album, this is still pretty heavy one. Nothing to do with the quality of the music, definitely not. Let's see.
For me, the most fascinating aspect of this is that, like, the way it usually goes, let's say, with somebody who has accumulated the need to put out music at an early age, they are empty once they do, and there's nothing. Like, it takes some time to kind of like refill the creative chambers, let's say. But this album is just, it doesn't seem to be coming from anything that he's done, at least publicly, before. The themes, and even like the whole vibe of it is so unique and so special and so different. And like almost instantly, after the release of Tubular Bells, he must have started working on this.
Yes.
Just playing on keyboards or on guitars or whatever. And that's sort of like, I still have to say, the most fascinating for me. So like, even then it was kind of clear already that he's not a one-trick pony.
Yes. Maybe we can start off just for definition's sake. This is one of the few pieces where there are really three different various versions available, which I think are far more than just different mixes, as they're called. But we have three realizations of this piece, which are, even though the differences are subtle, the effect is, I think, very big. And so we have the original 1974 mix, we have the 1976, I believe, box mix, and then the 2010 remix and remaster from the deluxe edition. So maybe we can start off just by giving an impression of their differences without getting too nerdy about this. But I love the fact that we have these three different realizations of the same material, because precisely because this is so minimal and so reduced to the essence, the effect even of these relatively minor differences is still tremendous. So to me, the 1974 original mix, this is sort of a symphonic poem, I think. It has the trumpet in there, it has percussion in there, it has the nutcracker in there somewhere. I don't know if that is a Tchaikovsky or a ballet reference or just a joke. Then we have the interweaving of these patterns. The orchestral HERGEST RIDGE, which was done a little later, it sounds astoundingly close to this version, because I think even though it's not symphonic, it doesn't have strings, it doesn't have the whole apparatus of the orchestra, the way he writes it gives it this symphonic quality. Then the 1976 boxed mix, I would call this an epic folk fantasy. So he tones down the orchestral feeling and the grandeur of the original one, and he creates a even more sparse version. I find this to be stunningly beautiful in some places. Especially, I think the second part, that one is to me is my favorite of all the three ones. Although I don't particularly like the opening movement on this one, because it's more guitar centric, it sometimes almost feels like it's bordering space rock, like it has passages at the end of the first movement which almost border Pink Floyd. It has a beautiful guitar tone. There are passages where the guitar plays passages with the other ones is taken over by different instruments. I think it's fantastic. And then the 2010 mix is, I would call this, he brings back the symphonic elements. He's talked about the fact that the original version had felt, I think, cluttered. I'm not quite sure if that was the word, but he wasn't happy with the clarity. So now the clarity is possible through the digital medium. So it allows him to bring in all these elements again, but now they're clear.
And he brings elements in that weren't in any of the other two mixes.
Yeah. It's a fascinating mix. I think it lacks the warmth of the original two, but it's fantastic. It's a fantastic...
Yeah, I love it, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, like I think we kind of like, if we really want to talk about the mix also, we need to talk about what kind of elements he introduced in terms of arrangement and orchestration, which some of which were kind of like also trademark things that kept going for a long time. So for example, this idea to combine, to not harmonize, but to double parts, but not to double them with the same sound, to double them with kind of like even contradicting sounds. So you have like a percussive acoustic guitar with a strong attack and short sustain, combined with a sustained electric guitar, which he does a lot on these melodies. And then he's also ornamenting the doubled instruments differently. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, I guess, some sort of orchestra of, like, I don't know if like some people would play tin whistle together, right? They wouldn't really compose how they ornament the parts. They would all ornament them slightly differently. They still play the same melody, but so you get like sort of this incredible complexity of like you could say almost chaotic. So things that you don't really, and especially nowadays, you don't do in music production at all anymore. And so when you talk about like that, it's sort of like reduced and minimal, the composition in ways. It's interesting because I think it's highly complex again in parts where there's like themes layered upon a theme and so on, where just the accompaniment of the acoustic guitar is already a melody in itself. And actually, like really, like the biggest feature of HERGEST RIDGE is that the chord changes themselves are a melody. Mm. So if you could only listen to the triads, to the progression of the triads, and that is the melody in itself, right? So, and then on top of that, he builds melody upon melody, and that's what kind of like makes these different mixes possible.
Yes.
You know, so it's important to note that. And then realizing in the 2010 version that there were melodies there played on top of things that I didn't know he had even recorded, that was really fascinating. Especially in the sections where he kind of like left it down to the chord melodies, with the choir section in part 1, for example, where it's, you know, all just the chord changes. It's wonderful.
I think in the booklet to Box, he says it's an experiment in texture, which is exactly what it is. And I love the fact that he's approaching texture from a compositional angle and not from a sound angle. So he doesn't just hold a chord for a very long time. Or he comes up with, an electronic patch or something. No, he actually composes the texture. And that's what makes the 2010 mix so interesting. I think that's probably also what you're referring to, is that there are sections where elements which used to be textural in the previous versions are now moving to the fore. And suddenly you realize, oh, it's a melody. It's a theme, which can cause irritation, which has caused irritation, even though I think most people now prefer the 2000 mix to the earlier ones. There are sections in there which are suddenly more or less textural, less ambient, as it were, and now are more in your face.
Yeah, and some extra elements of rhythm guitar, for example, that people were complaining about. Yeah. But I was very happy to hear them, because it's cool. Like, you could see that his world. And I've said that before when we mentioned Omadon already a little bit in one of the last episodes, is that his plan is much bigger than what we get to hear. And we can see this here as well. And, you know, what I noticed again is that this is a record where he starts using the guitar as an organ.
Yes.
Like, so he overdubs single note lines that turn into a texture, into a chordal texture. Which, like, the most prominent way that he was doing that was in side 2 of Omadon, the beginning, where he just had that huge guitar organ, basically, right? But here in HERGEST RIDGE, it's already a wonderful device of creating a sort of chordal texture that nobody else had ever recorded. And in combination with different kinds of organs. And here I really don't know which kind of organs he used on this album, but it's a really unique texture.
I think Farfisa and Lowry, and then there's a third one which I can't remember.
Solina string or something?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, okay.
And that is that, of course, the additional trick is to use, to use the guitar and create something you could have maybe created sort of much easier with the organs, but you create it with the guitar, and then that is subtly different from the actual organs, which are also in the piece.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he kind of like uses, as you say, sort of like a symphonic techniques to play individual sustained notes and combines them to, like, it's like a string section kind of thing, but with electric guitar. Yeah, and I really, like, listening back now, I have started noticing that, like, the whole record is, has a lot of that. Which really, because as you say, when you listen to it, it's sort of like a background, foreground way. Sometimes things kind of like get lost because you're not focusing on them when you're listening. Yeah, and really, so there's no real percussion / drum kit on this at all, even though, I mean, in the original mix, you can hear the snare drum very, very faintly, like in the left channel, which I think in the box version, it's louder.
There are definitely some weird mixing choices in the first one. I don't know if those were intended to be louder, actually. I'm not quite sure. I think, for example, the voices, that is one thing he definitely changed on the second version. In 1976, he brought the voices out more to the front. I'm astounded they were mixed so far back in the original one. I think I can't believe this was the intention. I think the percussion, it might have been, I think the idea might have been there to have them more prominent in the beginning or not to have them at all. But I think some of the choices are surprising looking back.
Yeah, I mean, there's the jingly bells in the first section, right? After the bass solo part, let's say. In both the first two mixes, you only have the like sleigh bells. That's what it is. Yeah. And so, but in the 2010 version, that's like there's a rhythm guitar track on top of that, which is kind of like playing the same kind of rhythm as the sleigh bells, and it's very interesting to see. So there are elements that have that animated quality to them, but it's just kind of like you could say like straight like eighth notes and something like that. And the whole album is actually based on a rhythm that he's used in Tubular Bells, which is the right?
Yeah, you showed me this last time.
And he builds a whole section around that rhythm on side 2, which is the electrical storm, I think it's called, or something like that.
Thunderstorm?
Yeah, or thunderstorm. And it's fascinating because because if you have a rhythm like dub, da, 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 you could start that rhythm in 4 different places because and so he superimposes that rhythm with itself but shifted by an eighth note. And I love that section because if you just don't pay attention, like it turns around and you hear it the other way around, you get this sort of like this auditory illusion kind of thing happening there, which has always been fascinating. So, and that kind of like changes the feel of the section before and after in an interesting way, where it could feel like a reggae, where the accents are on the 2 and 4, but actually they're on 2 and 4 or something, and it's really cool.
HERGEST RIDGE, a reggae fantasy.
A reggae fantasy and raga fantasy. Yeah, I mean, like drone, it's a good question. You said like he doesn't really use like just a harmonic drone. It's true, except for the very beginning and the very end of part 1 and the end of part 2, where there's like a really beautiful, wonderful drone, just like the E minor chord on an F sharp bass note, with some chromatic notes in the ornamentation or the acoustic guitar and stuff. It's really it does have these moments of drone music, let's say. There are also a couple melodies on both sides, sort of like transitional melodies, which are really dissonant. Mm-hmm. So where it's sort of like the opposite of the other sections, where things are organized and where there's this, and I mean like, so there's one very, very interesting thing about the theme or the themes that he uses in this album. This trick to actually create a melody that is modulating, right? So it goes to a different key. That is something that is used in music all the time, right? So in classical music, also in pop music, where you have like the last chorus is transposed up a whole step or something like that, right? But here, what he does is that the basic theme is just, and it's particularly pronounced in the beginning of the second half. It's an 8-bar melody, right? But he has sort of like 2 versions of it, and the modulation, the modulation happens not at the end as it normally would with most people, happens in the middle. So it's the first 4 bars and the second 4 bars. So he has 2 versions of the second 4 bars, and you have a different modulation. So it's cool because it feels very seamless, because you're expecting the harmonic change to kind of like to the modulation to happen at the end of the 8 bars. It happens right in the middle.
Yeah.
And that is such a cool thing that kind of contributes to this feel of it being such a flow, And with Incantations, where he did this like to the extreme, this modulating thing, that is like is more simplistic in a way. Like with HERGEST RIDGE, it's more hidden and beautiful, and sort of like the melody goes into sort of like an inversion of itself, so it sounds as if it's the same thing, but it's really not. And yes. Very cool.
I wanted to ask you about that. So last week we talked about this a bit already, because last week we were originally going to record this podcast, which we're talking which we're recording now, but I had forgotten the SD card of the recorder we're using, so we couldn't actually tape it. But I think we had a few preliminary conversations about this, and I showed you a timeline which I created of the 2 movements with my interpretation of the themes used on this. It was interesting for me to see when I browsed the forums is that I think most people are not aware how few themes there are. And then I showed you this, and I think my version has 3 themes essentially. for 40 minutes of music. And then you said, well, you could actually say that it's one theme. And thinking about this more and more, I think could be true. And since you've seen the score, it would be interesting to me. It seems like something I noticed on Return to Armageddon, particularly as well, is that it's almost like he's using the original theme and then chopping smaller segments and then using them for a second theme, different rhythm, different meter, different feeling. But it's almost like there's a stem cell, and then from this stem cell he creates everything else, and that gives it this coherence, and at the same time allow different emotional, like a different emotion attached to these feelings, also of these sections. Do you think that after looking at the score that we're really working with essentially one theme? There are definitely very similar interval jumps and
Yeah, I think, with this album in particular, and also with Incantations, it's first of all, it's the melody is the harmony is the melody, right? So that as I've already said, so the progression itself is a harmonic flow, and so that's why what happens is that the melodic themes that are being used are, so the second part, right? The melody is very clear, right? It's also fast enough, let's say, so that you can grasp it like as a melody, that's a repeating melody. With the first side, it's slow, and it's slow in such a way that you kind of like get drawn into it. It's not that he's kind of like shoving it in your face, let's say, like here is and so really it all is just sort of like a variation of a set of ideas, right? I would just call it ideas, not necessarily themes or whatever, because as you say, he constantly goes between, as you said, taking a little motif from something and working with that rather than the whole thing. So it's like this zooming in and zooming out of the parts and leaving spaces.
Yes.
And also, and this is not to be underestimated, also using counterpoint a lot in this record. Mm-hmm. So for example, when you're talking about the trumpet, yeah, I mean, like in some mixes you hear, it looks like it's like just one trumpet, and you hear the other mix and you hear, okay, there's actually two trumpets playing counter movement and stuff like that. And it's really difficult unless you would wanna, and I'm kind of like not even interested in analyzing everything completely. It would be possible, but so the big, with HERGEST RIDGE, the thing that I noticed most is that there is this part that later or at some point was released, I don't know, as a single but as the Spanish tune, which is the second section and the penultimate section on side 2. That is a unique theme. So that one, and not just melodically, but and this is where the big difference lies, harmonically. So where everything else on the album is just sort of like a simple triad-based harmony, the Spanish tune has much more complex chords. Really kind of, he seems completely out of his element. I mean, not that it doesn't sound like it's his element, but in terms of a composition, like to suddenly take these complex chords with all those extensions is really sticking out. Yeah,
it's only 5 minutes of music in total on the entire album, and it feels like the main theme. Because it's such a non sequitur. It's just it appears out of nothing, then returns. It doesn't evolve. I have a theory about that, but it's. I agree. This one sticks out.
It sticks out, and it's totally unexpected too, because we don't get to hear that in the. Well, actually, I mean, it's not 100% true what we're saying. It is like the coda of the Spanish tune is also the coda of the choir, piano and choir part on part one.
And also the intervals are again similar.
Yes, but still, it is different. And also, like what is cool that these complex chords, and that's why I would kind of like also at some point it would be interesting to make a proper musical analysis of the whole piece. A lot of the extensions of the chords, stuff like that, happens via the harmonic information that's introduced by the melodies. Mm-hmm. So even though you may have like just a simple 3-note chord, a triad sitting underneath, the melodies, they really don't do what you would expect them to do. Again, this is something that in some parts of side 2 of Tubular Bells he's doing, where like there are two melodies that coincide that use the like a yin and yang version of the notes from the scale, right? And something like that is happening here as well in a very, very subtle and beautiful way. And so when you want to compose something that has sort of like a, should I say, you're kind of crossing different kind of keys and also unrelated keys with each other. So there is a device called like medians. Like, so what you would do, you would go from A minor to C minor. So those two chords or notes, those 3 notes, they are not necessarily part of the same scale, but some of the notes are, right? And what he does here with the theme that sort of transposes in the middle, as I said, is he uses actually a tritone relationship. So he goes from an E minor to a B flat major chord.
This is in the Spanish?
No, it's the first tune on the second half, which again is a variation of the first tune of the first half, but of the first part. But anyway, it's sort of like this kind of thing where he does not go to the cliches where you would do a relationship that's a third. So he actually takes the tritone relationship and kind of like, but then by going from minor to major, keeps it sort of in the ballpark. So it is kind of like modally related, and only one note needs to get changed, in the melody. But it's sort of kind of like opens this whole. It's fascinating. Like I wouldn't really know how it sounds like to people who have no music theory knowledge or musical training, but it clearly is something that is magical, unexpected, and sort of artful in a way that, for me, contradicts terms like that it's simple. If you know what I mean. Right?
Yes.
Right.
It isn't simple. No. It's, I said reduced. No. I'm not talking about what you said. I mean, in the general, it's like that is. I've said this before, that there's like this. Mike Oldfield makes things sound simple. Yes.
Right, because he can, and that's wonderful.
Even though I think he's gone on record to say that this record was anything but simple to make. Mm-hmm. But I think that wasn't a question of the musical challenges, as more that the motivational challenges to actually finish it. There were 2 studio sessions booked, which never yielded anything. Ultimately, of course, it was done pretty quickly then. And
Tom Newman was involved, right?
Yes.
And the demo, which is on the deluxe edition, 2010 deluxe edition, shows that he had pretty much, already recorded the whole piece before it got committed in its final version, and then it wasn't the final version, as you said. Yeah, you're right. And maybe the fact that it was such a struggle to make kind of led to him kind of being a little bit dismissive of the piece over the years.
I think so, yes. I have my theory how the box version came about. I've seen several interviews from him over the years, and the one thing he's always stressed is that he's not writing orchestral music. He's very, very particular about that, which is weird because these days, many artists who are definitely not composers try to define themselves as composers. Despite, and I'm not necessarily trying to make composers more than what they are, but I think it's a certain craftsmanship that you acquire, which many artists simply do not have. And It seems like he's trying to get away from being stigmatized into being a composer of orchestral, new orchestral music. He wanted to be something different. And then when Tubular Bells became so big, and when there was this recording of the symphonic Tubular Bells and HERGEST RIDGE, I think when he heard these versions, I think I'm not sure about the Tubular Bells one, but the HERGEST RIDGE version, I think we both agree, is fantastic. It's whatever you think about the orchestral Tubular Bells, I think the HERGEST RIDGE version is actually incredible. I'm not saying it's better, but it's as good, and it's there's a sections in there which work incredibly well on strings. So I have this idea that after seeing the orchestral HERGEST RIDGE, I think rather than what is written in Changeling, where he says that it wasn't bad, but it wasn't the way I wanted it to be played, I think he realized that it was actually better than he thought it would be. And because this version would have probably, if released, would have put him more into the orchestral corner. I think he actually reduced it down to something which was less symphonic in the boxed version, just for him, because he felt more at home. Even though the work itself clearly, I mean, the opening minute, to me, I don't know if it's like we won't be able to prove it, but it's so similar to Mahler's First Symphony, the opening bars of Mahler's First Symphony. There's the drone, there's the intervals, like the Mahler's First Symphony is it's reduced to very primal intervals, and then working with them and keeping this sustained atmosphere before it actually the music opens up into a more tangible composition. There's very big similarities.
Yeah, there are a few things you just said that I want to comment on. So first of all, again, like going back to the question, like how many themes are there? Right? I think what we get is basically one theme, yeah, with different kinds of ornamentations, right? That's the way to look at it. And then they are presented at different speeds. So that means at some point, like an ornamentation becomes an actual noticeable melody when it's slowed down, and it's stuff like that. And we should not forget that, as far as I understand, David Bedford was involved, at least in arranging the choir. And then David Bedford did the orchestral version, right? So the sort of collaboration of the level of composition, this is it's kind of like sad that we don't know anything about it, in which way he may have kind of like discussed it or played it to his peers and gotten feedback on it, you know? Did you talk about the piece with David Bedford? I'm pretty sure he did. And then the fact that the orchestral version happened, I don't know. I mean, we just don't know, like in how far there was any sort of like plan in the first place to kind of like make something like that happen. And you say it works incredibly well. It in fact, yeah, it does. It's just sort of interesting to hear that the bluesy guitar melodies played by clarinets and oboes, and you know, yes, how well that works. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
and like the really high kind of like aching, beautiful distorted guitar melodies with all those bends and stuff, played by a solo violin, you know.
And the bass really played by a cello, which actually I think is fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas the rhythmical, like the bass work on the orchestral Tubular Bells, I don't think is very successful.
No, that doesn't work at all.
But this works really well.
Yeah.
So no official recording of that one yet. So probably also no podcast on it. But I think it warrants a recording.
Yeah. I mean, I actually saw, like, I can't remember when, like maybe 5-6 years ago, there was Tubular Bells, the David Bedford version was played in London again, and I was there, and yeah, it's not very satisfying, especially if, and this is something we pointed out already, if the conductor doesn't really have control over the tempos properly. But anyway, like speaking of HERGEST RIDGE, yeah, like, if that score, the orchestral score, would be played again, that would be quite something.
I mean, you've hinted at it, sort of that making of it was not very happy, and probably the time wasn't very happy. I think in a way this is like a basic psychology thing, is that Tubular Bells was made when he was forced to interact with other people through work. He played in a band. He was it was fun on stage. It wasn't always fun, but it was fun a lot of the time. He had different projects going on. There was a lot going on. He was growing, etc., etc. And then, but probably not that. Probably wouldn't have been his ideal version of his career. So then he records Tubular Bells, and everything's in there. His entire life up to that point, and then he moves, and then he has the financial freedom to go to the countryside and do what he ever wanted to do.
But you say financial freedom, but as far as I remember from Changeling, from his book, it's like he got £15 per week or
25, yes,
or something like that. So even though that was a big success, but he didn't really receive any of that money.
A long time,
yes. Yeah, and I remember. Wasn't it that there was no heating or something?
Yeah, he got a heating, freezing, I think, at the end of, after he recorded it, and he got a heating which worked. Mm-hmm. Yes. But he was at least, I mean, he could afford to move away from the city and just focus on music, on his music. Mm. And I think this was probably his dream, and it didn't turn out to be a dream in practice, which isn't all that strange. I think when you're a withdrawn person, you wish your life to be withdrawn. And then, this is also speaking partly from personal experience. And then when you actually do get away from everyone and everything, it's actually harder in a way, because you're thrown back to yourself in many respects. Mm-hmm. I think that what makes this music fantastic, probably. I mean, it has this mood which goes throughout, but it has, if it does break from this mood, it's really violent and, violent. It's sort of explosive. It's really, it moves quickly from the calm to the energetic and loud. These transitions are very extreme and quick, and so that does indicate a certain turmoil, inner turmoil.
Yeah, but the funny thing is though that, so again, speaking of themes, like what counts as its own theme. There is the theme before the second time the Spanish theme, yes, Spanish tune comes. And that is sort of like a really beautiful short folk kind of melody. And that is the melody that the loud section uses.
Yes.
So it's really funny. So in a way, we get sort of like the aggressive loud part is based on this jolly folk tune, right? So, but we get presented with the loud version first, and then we get the release into the just acoustic guitar and organ or something, like, and then it goes to the Spanish tune. And again, it's sort of like a fascinating idea to arrange this like a light melody with a heavy sound, and that's sort of like happening kind of like throughout the album somehow. Like I said, you get these kind of combinations of sustained sounds and short sounds, and also like the relentlessness of the do 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 do, which is the accompaniment for the first 10 minutes. Right, yes. And so it's
which is actually also Mahleri. Now I'm actually singling it out. This is also similar to a theme from the First Symphony. I don't know. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. And then again, like, I wouldn't say there's anything really that relates back to HERGEST RIDGE much, with the exception of some parts of Return to Omadon, where there's like a
yes.
Clear.
Yeah.
And other than that, yes, like maybe this combination of acoustic, plucked guitar sounds with the sustained electric guitar sounds, you get that interestingly enough on records like Guitars. Also some other records, but it's really, there's nothing really that is very obviously being reharvested throughout his career.
This is a question which I'm curious about your opinion on. And I hinted at this when we spoke about this previously. Is that to me it always feels like the first 3 albums are more than just a trilogy because they're closely written in close association, but because they do share a sort of musical DNA. The opening section, which in my calculations goes on for about 8 minutes, is based on or shares melodic elements from the finale of the first movement of Tubular Bells. And then the Spanish tune with the singing, to me is a hint to what's to come, which is Omadon. So it seems to be sort of a link between these 2 works. I haven't yet made the experiment, that's something maybe for next time, to actually listen to them in succession, in sequence. What I do find is that although he stressed that it's very different from Tubular Bells, and I think we've established that it's different from it, he does play with the fact that it's the second album. I've thought about this just as a thought experiment. What would have happened if HERGEST RIDGE had been his first album? Then he'd recorded Tubular Bells. But it's not possible. I don't think that the way they're written, that is even possible. For example, if you take the bass, the solo bass line in the opening movement of HERGEST RIDGE, that is sort of something that harks back to Tubular Bells, or something they share. And then in Tubular Bells, it goes into this finale. But here it doesn't. It actually goes back to something that was previously. It doesn't yet fulfill. And then in the second movement, it does lead into something, but it's sort of an anticlimax as well, because it goes into this passage which to most listeners is really monotonous. I don't think it's monotonous, really, because what is happening sort of behind this wall of brutal sound. But still, I think it's anticlimactic as well. So he's playing with the fact that the bass line leads into this gorgeous finale in Tubular Bells, and here it leads into something either to nothing or something very unexpected. So he plays with the fact that as a listener, we are aware of Tubular Bells, I think.
I mean, yeah, that's a very good point, and something we should really maybe talk about for every album. Like, what is the relation to Tubular Bells, and do we get any Tubular Bells themes in it? First of all, HERGEST RIDGE has the instrument Tubular Bells in it as the climax or end of the first section before the outro, right? First part, sorry, and. Also, and this is something that we haven't really talked about yet, but we actually get, so you know that Mike at some later point said that the Tubular Bells was inspired by the toccata and fugue part, actually the fugue part, right, of Bach's piece. And so here we get, in HERGEST RIDGE, we get the actual part. Right, like so. With the high note is the hammer. We get that as the accompaniment comes in right at the beginning when the chords start moving under the theme at the very beginning of the piece, right? So it's really cool that he does to manage to build that in, and it sort of like is not something that is in the foreground, but it's fascinating. And then kind of like some of the melodies, like like I said, the slower melodies are broken up into these ornaments. You can hear these kinds of movements with the alternation with one note and like the other voice kind of like moving up and down. You can hear that too, and it's pretty cool. And in that regard, like when we look at, as you say, you call it like a trilogy or maybe more than a trilogy, the first 3 albums, I find that they each have like a very, very unique starting point that is kind of like interestingly like more different than you would expect. But then seeing how, obviously, because like as a musician, you have sort of like a repertoire that you can kind of draw from also, like in physically, like what can you actually play?
Yes.
And so there are certain similarities always, yes. And I totally agree, like that the Spanish tune and then the sung Amadon section, you know, that sort of like is clearly related.
It's even partly the same singers. I mean, it's...
Oh yeah, for sure. Also on Amadon, like there's Tubular Bells, you know, the instrument Tubular Bells. I'm pointing this out because it's interesting, because later on in his career we have a track which is kind of very close to the structure of Tubular Bells. That's called the wind chimes. So the mini Tubular Bells, right?
Yes.
And yeah, I think we should always kind of like point out these relationships as well there.
And just as a side note, I think the on the 2010 mix, that section where the Tubular Bells comes in the first section, that's the most beautiful recording of the Tubular Bells that we've ever had. It's so incredibly gorgeous. It captures the metallic glow of this instrument so perfectly. It's worth listening to their music just for the sound of the Tubular Bells on that one. It's far more beautiful than on Tubular Bells.
Yes.
It's of course understated. It doesn't try to be like this triumphant thing, but it's triumphant in its way because of this understatement, because it's rich and luminous and.
It's funny. So like now that we're talking about it, so on Platinum, yeah, I Got Rhythm, the cover song. That's the one that has the Tubular Bells on it, and it's sort of interesting how. I mean, it's kind of cool, you know. You sort of like have some sort of like random success, let's say, with something, and then you kind of start reutilizing these iconic elements. It's pretty cool.
It's I think it's cool, especially because it's not one thing. It could be sort of like a painter signing his paintings in the corner. That could be it, but I think it's more, and I think you've referred to it as a sort of metaphoric language, which I think is probably a great way. Also, maybe I'm just came to think about this now, is that because he's really emphasized that he's not a composer, maybe it's the sheer joy of enriching his music with these secret messages, which you have to dig into. And you have to be sort of you have to be initiated to fully appreciate it. But it's not about being clever. It's sort of it's like a game on a very high level game, and you're either in or you're out.
You know, I have two associations now with things that he has said or written. So, for example, at the very end of the book Changeling, which is like sitting here on the table with us. He says that, and that was like maybe 2007 or so, and he says like, in the future, I want to be my music as simple or as mathematical as it wants to be. So you could clearly see that he is thinking in those terms, right? Yeah. And I remember an interview, like a radio interview from around the QE2 times, where he was also saying that he's still aiming for like the most spiritual experience with his music. I find that fascinating, right? Like folkloristic, spiritual, mathematical, and that sort of like really describes what he does. Really describe, and especially like Tubular Bells is the exception, right? That is sort of like that's the coming out, right? So and everything is sort of like has a little bit feral energy, right? Where HERGEST RIDGE is very, very considered, and like funny that you keep pointing out that he has said he's not a composer as in a classical composer, but very clearly is, you know, especially with this work, you know.
Maybe I'm misquoting him on the composer thing, but he's definitely been very strictly against this idea that he's composing orchestral or symphonic music.
Yes. I mean, it's because what he does with this orchestration, with this instrumentation, sounds so much cooler.
Yes, and maybe also because he's actually doing it himself.
Yeah.
You know, he's doing it himself, and Whereas the composer, I'm exaggerating now, and this is of course tongue in cheek, but the composer can sit back and have the musicians play his music or her music.
Yeah. So for him, the actual sound, the texture, the performance, like we said, the tempos, everything is so important. It's tied to really what the music is that you can't really. I don't think it has anything to do with being a control freak or anything. It's just that. So if you know you need a certain ratio, let's say, of ingredients, then you and otherwise it doesn't work. Then you have to kind of make sure that it does work, right? And you could say, oh, then that means it's not a good composition if you can't just play it on an acoustic guitar and it works, or, like people say that kind of thing. And then again, I think, as it's sort of in hindsight, if you like go back and you pick any melody, anything, any part of any of his albums, and you play that on a piano or on a solo instrument, on an acoustic guitar, it's incredibly beautiful and works.
Apparently, what he said is that most of the music gets written on the piano rather than the guitar, which is also interesting.
Yes, and which again, like I'm not exactly sure if that's always true. When you hear some guitar improvisations where he's playing music that, like in a professional recorded form, was never performed on a guitar. So it can also be the other way around sometimes. Yeah.
I was interested in your opinion on, because I saw in the boxed booklet there are very nice images of, I think, the recording space or the composing space he used to work on HERGEST RIDGE, and there is like he lines up his wall with all the guitars and a few of the basses he's playing, and it's a lot of guitars. I mean, it's probably around 10 different guitars. Can you, as a guitarist, can you hear that? Is that a sonic question? Is it a question just of performance? But like one of them is allowing...
on Tubular Bells, you only used one electric guitar.
Yeah.
And, a couple acoustics, I guess. Like you use the metaphor of painting, being a painter. So it's just like having more options for sounds. And yes, you can hear it. Like there's a nylon string guitar, it's a steel string guitar, it's different sounding electric guitars. Back then, like I don't know, like the electric guitar side, I feel there's like still. It's also because he's such a distinguishable player. Like you don't really the instrument doesn't count that much. With the exception of like the different sounds he developed over the years. So when he then kind of became a Strat player, which sort of like, as far as I understand, was inspired by Mark Knopfler even, that is a very unique sound, him playing Strat, but that was later on in his career. So here, it's pretty much about color palette, I would say. And he was playing acoustic bass guitar quite a bit around that time. And everything has this sort of folksy, acoustic, open sounding vibe about it, and it's great. Kind of creates this very, very unique. I think like what people call about like the pastoral sound of HERGEST RIDGE is also very much in the orchestration, in the instrument used.
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah, the tin whistles. Right?
Tin whistles, yeah.
Yeah, that's really a very, very unique sound. And I mean, I'm sure we're like missing out on a few like really major, like important things. But I think like we've mostly covered it. And like I said at the beginning, for me, this is maybe. I mean, it's very difficult to say because I love his music so much. But HERGEST RIDGE is pure perfection. And I really hope that people will check it out if they haven't heard it.
Do you prefer any of the mixes? I suppose you got to know the piece through the CD version.
No, I think it was the box. The box mix, which was on the CD, right? No, but I also had the vinyl early on. So, and I don't exactly remember which version I heard first. I think it was the boxed version that I heard first. But I have to say, like, of all of the deluxe editions, all of the remixes he did, HERGEST RIDGE is the best.
Yes, I agree.
Also the surround version, the 5.1 version, is really incredible. It's one of the more convincing. Somehow he must have really felt inspired and happy working on that again. Whereas on some other reissues, like it felt like he was lazy, But here, this was.
He's definitely had lots of good positive feedback. I know he's mentioned that people from the industry came up to him and said, Tubular Bells is great, but I really, really, really like HERGEST RIDGE, which I think was surprising to him. And then my initial thought was that he wanted to get it right this time, which could have been a sign of dissatisfaction, but I don't think so, because then he would have, I agree, he would have approached it with less detail.
I think Omadon is really maybe the record where he got into the studio with the intention of doing something that sort of like sets the record straight somehow, and in a way the record kind of like is successful in that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Something we forgot. So there's people don't usually think of Mike Oldfield as a virtuoso, but he is.
Yeah.
And so there's the Omadon, like the fast triplety solo in the middle of part 1, which, funnily enough, here at the beginning of part 2, we have that kind of fast triplet electric guitar part in the background, which is very, very cool and very, very unique to him. That's sort of like another sort of element that kind of like points to the future. But having said that, like he really never, because he has and did have so many musical memes, let's say, to draw from the very beginning, it's not that he had to overdo one thing so much.
Yes.
Like people may criticize him for like okay, always referring back to Tubular Bells, which it's fine because like it's him, right? So, but anyway, so this fast triplety thing, he didn't do that so much. Like you find it, as I said, you find it in HERGEST RIDGE, on Omadon, you find it on Amarok, obviously, right? You find it a little bit, maybe say in albums like 5 Miles Out. And, but then like this kind of musical device hasn't been kind of used otherwise. And then it's cool because like you could say, okay, he's used the Tubular Bells on all albums or a variation of that. But it's more interesting to see, okay, which things did he not use on particular albums? Like when we're getting to the Songs of Distant Earth, for example, where he suddenly changes his style like 180 degrees.
Yes.
Like incredible, right? And so I'm looking forward to getting to that. So do you want to have the last word today?
I'm not sure, but I just one thing about the guitar thing, which I think we may get into later, and especially with Omadon, is that the virtuoso thing for me has been in the sound itself, because I think getting this sound so clear and so direct and almost like you can hear almost his fingers in the sound,
yes,
creating it.
Yes.
I think that has always been the virtuoso aspect of it.
Exactly. His playing technique to stop all the strings all the time, which like electric guitarists usually don't do.
Yeah.
And that's why you get like the clarity and the voice quality like of his playing is totally unique.
Well, if I have to have the last word, then it would be that you said that to you it's maybe the greatest of all time. Funny thing is, it's also to me that if we ever get to do a ranking video, or ranking podcast, which would probably be against sort of our beliefs, probably it would be my number one as well. Which is interesting because it hasn't been that way for forever, but over time it's kept growing.
Yes.
In my appreciation.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for listening. HERGEST RIDGE, please check it out. The GOAT. And see you next time. Bye.